Hello students, this is Professor McDonald. This will be some of my professor comments for Chapter 4, which is entitled Physical Evidence. The chapter starts off talking about two types of proof that are used during a criminal trial to determine the question of guilt or innocence by a jury. And these are the two types of evidence that they do see during a trial. The first one is direct evidence. When we're talking about direct evidence, that normally involves eyewitnesses who have either seen someone or in some way can connect a person directly to a crime scene or to a crime itself. I would also put something like a video in. Let's say if you had an armed robbery of a bank and you have a video clearly showing a person's face, and somebody can identify that person from that tape. To me, that is direct evidence that ties the person to the crime. On the other end of the spectrum is circumstantial evidence. And it differs in the sense that it's evidence, and it's just as powerful as direct evidence in many ways, but the jury has to infer, in other words, make an inference that this particular piece of evidence is connected to a crime. For example, a fingerprint. A fingerprint by itself doesn't say that, hey, so-and-so committed this crime. But if a fingerprint that's collected at a crime scene does show that that individual was at that crime scene at some point. Now, whether or not the prosecutor can prove that that person had no business being there, and the only person whose fingerprints would have been at that scene would be the suspect or the perpetrator of the crime, then it becomes a very powerful piece of evidence. Other things like blood, tool marks, and when they're talking about tool marks, they're talking like for on a burglary, if somebody uses let's say a screwdriver to pry open a door. When they do that, if the door is wooden, it will leave an impression or a tool mark in the wood itself. And these items can be analyzed, photographed and analyzed, and actually connected directly to a particular tool by the crime laboratory. But anyway, with circumstantial evidence, there has to be an inference. So if a person's fingerprint, say for example, is found at a crime, and this is a person that really had no access to a house where, let's say for example, a homicide occurred, then that's a powerful piece of evidence, and the jury can infer that that print shows that that person was at the crime scene. Now, another topic they talk about, and the title of the chapter itself is physical evidence. And there are two types of broad categories that physical evidence falls into. Number one is class, and what they mean by that, you link that physical evidence to a class of objects. Like a tool mark impression, like I just explained, if that could be connected to a particular screwdriver that's in the possession of the suspect, that would be a piece of strong evidence. Let's say we have a hit and run, and the police are able to link a particular glass that was recovered at the scene to a manufactured glass that appears or is contained in certain vehicles, and the suspect was driving that vehicle. Then again, you have a piece of evidence that could have some value to a prosecution. That's called class evidence. And other things are paint, shoe prints, ballistics, things of that nature. On the other hand, individual evidence can actually be linked to a person or a specific object. One of the best examples of individual evidence is fingerprints. DNA is also a individual evidence, which directly links the print or the DNA sample to a human being. And if that is collected at a crime scene, that is a powerful piece of physical evidence relative to a prosecution. One of the next topics that the chapter covers is ballistics. And what ballistics is the identification of firearms, bullets, cartridges, and shotgun shells. I'm not going to go into all the different details of ballistics. All I can tell you is this is a very important ballistics present a powerful tool in helping criminal investigators solve crimes, in particular crimes where weapons are used. And so if you're at a crime scene where a gun has been used, and if the gun is there, obviously you're going to collect that gun. That's a very strong piece of evidence. You would also collect any projectiles that you can find, or bullets. Let's say there's some that are embedded in a wall. Maybe the individual the first shot missed the victim, and it's in a wall. They got to be careful in removing those from the walls, because you can actually destroy the identification of the bullet itself. Let's say if you dig it out with a penknife or something like that and you scratch up the piece of evidence. But also the cartridges themselves are valuable pieces of evidence. So anything collected to a firearm that's at a crime scene is valuable evidence that can be collected, and many times the gun itself can be linked back to an individual. Let's say if an individual shot somebody and in a panic he left the gun at the scene, and if that gun has a traceable serial number, the police might be able to track that gun to a particular suspect. In addition, or at least provide information as to who might have had possession of that gun at the time in question. But also, you could connect a crime. Let's say if you have a victim and they've been shot and killed, and the bullet is still in the victim. The removal of that bullet is a powerful piece of evidence that also can be used to connect that gun to the victim. So nonetheless, if you work in criminal investigation, there's a very good chance that you are going to be involved in collecting physical evidence such as weapons, cartridges, and bullets, etc., to help put together a case on a suspect. And what's interesting too with ballistics today too is there's a lot of interesting databases that are maintained where particular signatures on weapons can be linked to particular weapons themselves. And again, like I said, if you do work homicide or investigation where a victim has been shot and murdered, that bullet that's within that individual, they call it post-mortem forensic science. The doctors themselves hopefully have been trained properly, and in particular, especially if you're dealing with an experienced coroner who does the pathologist who does the autopsy on the victim, they have to be very careful in recovering the bullet, because that's a powerful piece of evidence at a crime, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bullet. I have recovered items. I worked on a bomb case once where the victim, he survived fortunately, but he was the victim of a bombing of a pipe bomb that was mailed to him, and the ends of the pipe cap actually ended up in his body, and he did survive, but we were able to recover those pieces of evidence, and they were used in the prosecution of the individual who was later identified as the mailer of the bomb. Other items of importance that also can be analyzed and collected at a crime scene, obviously blood, and if you get proper blood samples, you can DNA can be extracted from a blood sample. I like the information that's provided when they do blood splatter analysis. They have scientists that can do that, and that can tell you a lot about a crime scene, how an individual, or how the strike was made. Say if an individual was stabbed with a knife or hit with a hammer, those sort of things. The way the blood splatters, it can provide a lot of information to the investigators and to the crime scene investigators at the scene. Next, I wanted to talk about imprints and impressions. These are both also potentially powerful pieces of physical evidence. For example, an imprint is a marking left on a surface by protruding parts of a person or vehicle. Okay, an imprint found at a crime scene could include a bloody handprint or a footprint, or even a tire tread could be left behind if the person takes off very quickly and leaves the tread. Well, this is embedded in the object itself, like the road. Now, in collecting that type of evidence, the first thing you want to do is photograph it, and also put a scale in there so you get an idea what the size of that item is. Remember when we put rulers, you'll see them do that in this textbook. But photography of all this evidence before it's collected is very important. And they can actually, an experienced crime scene technician can actually lift that particular imprint from the surface using various techniques, sometimes powder, sometimes transparent tape. These are items that can be used to lift the imprint and study it later on. And obviously with a tire impression, if you can link that impression to a specific tire that goes on a certain car that is owned by a certain person, that's a powerful piece of evidence. Impressions are something that are made by a person or an object in a material softer than the item of evidence making the impression. This can also be tire tracks or footprints. Let's say left in the snow or in the sand. I've created plaster cast in crime scenes that I have worked from tire tracks, where they left a tire track, and there's a method where you basically create a plaster cast that you at the crime scene, you can collect this at the crime scene, and then you send it to the lab for analysis. And again, if it was a tire, trying to connect that particular tire to the particular tire on a suspect's vehicle. A footprint can be an impression. There's various things that can show up that way. And fingerprints can be found at crime scenes as either impressions or imprints. A bloody fingerprint left on a weapon, that's would be called a contaminated print, or what they call latent prints. And these are prints that they cannot be seen with the naked eye, but by using dusting procedures or whatever, it brings the oils in the print itself can be brought to the surface, and that particular print can be collected by the crime scene investigator. Tool marks also, if somebody pries open a door, like I said before, with a particular screwdriver that it has certain defects or striations on that screwdriver end in the wood, you can preserve that, and if you ever are able to recover a screwdriver that you think made the entry, and if it belongs to a particular individual, that could be another powerful piece of evidence. The textbook also talks about hair and glass and paint. These are all things that can be collected and can be analyzed as physical evidence. Fibers, I remember there was a famous serial killer named Wayne Williams in Atlanta, and the primary evidence on him was fibers. When he killed the young men that he was murdering, he would wrap them sometimes, or they would be, let me back up, they collected a rug which had fibers, and some of these fibers from that particular rug showed up on the victims themselves. And that was one of the key pieces of evidence. That would be circumstantial evidence that was that connected Williams to the victims. Very, very powerful piece of evidence. The last thing I'm going to talk about really quickly is question documents. This could be something like a forgery case. The check itself is a question document. It becomes a piece of evidence. It must be treated as such. And when you identify a suspect, you would then get known exemplars or known handwriting from that person. You can sometimes use business writing if they're not cooperative. What I used to do on cases like this, if the person wouldn't voluntarily provide a handwriting sample for comparison, we would get a grand jury subpoena where they would be forced then to provide it, or if they refused at that time, they could be held in contempt and placed in jail until such time as they did provide exemplars. And what you do then is you essentially compare the question writing, which let's say it's a check, against the known writing of the suspect. If the handwriting analyst can make a connection, and these guys are very good. When I was a postal inspector, we had one of the best question document laboratories in the United States. And I had a lot of cases when I was working complex fraud cases where handwriting was very, very critical to in documented analysis. And these guys, these analysts did some great work for me. And these, again, were our physical evidence. And the last thing I want to mention, there's a thing called indented writing. And think about it. If you're writing on a pad of paper, you write on the top. But if you lift that paper up and you look below, there's indentation where you had written. I know of a case where it was a extortion note was prepared, and when the police they did a trash run when these people put their trash out at night on the suspect's house, and they collected the trash. And when they were going through it, they found a pad of paper, and on that pad of paper, they found an indented note that actually matched up with the extortion note that had been provided. It was a very powerful piece of evidence, and the crime lab was able to pull those indentions up and then match them with the extortion note itself. Okay, that'll end this my professor comments for Chapter 4. End of dictation.